Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to be remaking John Summit's tune, What a Life. Before we get into the tedious details that inspired us all to go down this production rabbit hole, I want to let you know that you can download this project file as well as all the other project files for all the track remakes on this channel on my Patreon. The link's below. As is the case with a lot of music in this style, it uses swing. We'll be using the Swing Logic 16ths 55 preset, and we'll be applying it to every single clip in this song. In Groove Pool, make sure that the timing is the only setting set to 100% and everything else is at 0. The chord progression uses 3 different chords, starting with the 6th chord, which, since we're in the key of G minor, is E flat major. E flat major in its simplest form is a triad: E flat, G, and B flat, just 3 notes. But in this tune, it's an E flat major 7 chord, so we'll continue up to the 7th, D, E flat, G, B flat, and D. The next chord is the 5 chord, D minor. This chord is also a 7th chord, D minor 7. This chord is played in a slightly non-standard form. The voicing is motivated by the motion of the individual voices or melodies. Coming from the previous chord, E flat major 7, the D stays the same on top. That's the root of D minor 7. B flat moves up to C, which is the 7th. G moves down to F, which is the 3rd, and E flat moves down to D, which is a repetition of the root. The 3rd chord is the 1 chord. We're in G minor, so that would be a G minor chord. A G minor chord with the 7th and 11th, but no 9th. Another name for this chord might be G minor 7 add 4. Here we have G, the root, B flat, the 3rd, F, the 7th, and then C, the 11th or 4th. There's no 5th in this chord, but that's fine. You don't always need every note. Also, the root is doubled an octave lower. The 4th chord in this progression is a return to the 5 chord, D minor 7. Again, the voicing is motivated by the motion of the individual voices. So F moves down to D, C stays the same as C, B flat moves down to A, and G moves down to F. In this progression, we have the 5 chord, D minor 7, appear twice, but each time it's a different voicing. Now that we've got the chords together, let's dial in the rhythm. The tune is built around a syncopated rhythm that repeats every bar. In each of those bars, each chord is played 5 times. The first time, it takes up a space of 4 16th notes. The next 4 times, it takes up a space of only 3 16th notes. Each chord is articulated as an 8th note. This pattern then repeats for every chord and each bar throughout the entire song. Now let me show you how I made this sound. The sound is an organ sound, reminiscent of the late 80s or early 90s. It made me think of the Korg M1's organ sound. I used Ableton's Operator, which is an FM synth modeled after the Yamaha DX7. We're going to use all 4 operators. In FM synthesis, an operator is just the term for oscillator. In this case, we're going to have all of these operators or oscillators sounding in parallel. You can choose the way that the operators are routed by selecting an algorithm. You can do this by selecting the master panel and selecting one of these configurations on top here. While we're here in the global settings, change the voice amount to 16, change tone to 0%, and lower the volume to -12. Now we'll go over to operator A, select the panel, and change the volume to -8 decibels. The coarse setting determines where in the harmonic overtone series the oscillator or operator will sound. If you're not familiar with the overtone series, give it a Google. It's a wild concept. Set the coarse parameter of operator A to 1. We're going to set the envelope of all of these operators to these same settings. Attack to 1 millisecond, decay to 400 milliseconds, release to 100 milliseconds, and sustain to -16 decibels. Set the volume of operator B to -8 decibels. Everything on operator B will be the same as A, except we're going to set the coarse parameter to 2. Set the volume of operator C to -8 decibels. Again, everything here is going to be exactly the same as A and B, except we'll set the coarse parameter to 3. Also, we'll change the waveform to Saw 3. Set the volume of operator D to -8 decibels. Again, everything here will be the exact same as A, B, and C, except we'll change the coarse parameter to 6. And we'll change the waveform to square D. Click the filter panel, set the filter mode to low pass, 12 decibels per octave. Set the filter circuit to OSR. This will give us some filter drive settings. Now set the frequency to 1.5 kilohertz and the resonance to 2%. Now let's set up the filter envelope. Set attack to 30 milliseconds. Set the initial setting to 100% so that it starts wide open. Set decay to 800 milliseconds and release to 50 milliseconds. Set envelope to 15%. This controls how much the envelope affects the opening and closing of the filter when each note or chord is triggered. Let's change the filter drive settings. Shaper to sine. Set the dry wet to 30%. Filter drive to 1 decibel. And shaper drive to 1 decibel. Change frequency key to 50%. Lastly, set spread to 50% to give it a little bit of panorama. Now let me show you the effects chain on this organ sound. There's a channel EQ that is cutting the lows by 5 decibels, cutting the mids by 3 decibels, and boosting the highs by 3 decibels. Next, we've got some chorus, set to ensemble mode for a more intense effect, and width to 200%. Set the dry wet to 20%, and the rate to 1. Next, we'll add reverb using Ableton's hybrid reverb. Set pre-delay to 5 milliseconds. Change the dry wet to 25%. Set to only algorithmic mode. Change the algorithm to Chords, which gives us a modulated reverb tail. Lastly, we'll add compressor and use sidechain compression to get the organ sound pumping in response to the kick. Change the compressor display mode. I find this one easier to work with. Click this arrow to reveal the sidechain functions. We haven't yet built our drum kit, but when you do, this is where you'll go to Audio From and select your drum track, and in the menu underneath, select your specific kick drum sound. Activate sidechain. Turn off the EQ. Turn the threshold down to -33 decibels. Set ratio to 2:1 for a milder effect. Set attack to 5 milliseconds and release to 10 milliseconds. There you go. Now let's get these drums dialed in. We'll be using the kick sample Kick Bricks. In classic house style, put a kick on every quarter note, 4 on the floor. Set fade out to 75 milliseconds, activate the filter, and set the frequency to 2 kilohertz. Lower the gain by 1 decibel. All of this has served to just make the kick a little more muted. Next, let's set up our open hi-hat. We'll be using the hi-hat open 909 sample. Again, in classic house fashion, let's put the open hi-hat on the 8th note in between each one of these kicks. Fade in to 10 milliseconds, transpose to 10 semitones, activate the filter and set to high pass, 24 decibels per octave, and set the frequency to 800 hertz. Let's set up the closed hi-hat. We'll be using hi-hat closed 909 sample. Put a closed hi-hat on every quarter note, right along with the kick. Lower the volume from -12 to -18 decibels. Fade in 5 milliseconds. Transpose up 10 semitones. Activate the filter and set to high pass, 24 decibels per octave, and set the frequency to 1 kilohertz. Now that we've got our sound, let's go back and add some more closed hi-hats. Add a 16th note before and after every open hi-hat. This might sound a little awkward because in order to get the hi-hat sounding natural, we need the closed and open hi-hats to cut each other off the way that a real hi-hat works. You can only have the hi-hat open or closed, not both at the same time. This can be done with choke groups. Expand the drum rack menu and click the in and out button. Ableton gives you 16 different choke groups. The numbers are arbitrary. The important thing is that the sounds that you want to cut each other off are assigned to the same group. So we want to make sure that the open and closed hi-hat are both assigned to group 1. While we're here, let's add reverb using drum rack's dedicated sends and returns. These function exactly the same way that Ableton's sends and returns function, but entirely within drum rack. Turn on the bottom menu and select R, which will reveal the returns. Drag a reverb to this area. I'm going to use hybrid reverb. Make sure to set the dry wet to 100%, since we'll be using this to parallel process the drums. You can dial in the reverb amount to taste using the sends, which can be found by activating the S right above the R. I like to keep the kick completely dry, set the hi-hats and cymbals and shakers and other percussion to -12 decibels, and set claps, snares, rims, or any backbeat elements at -18 decibels. But set it wherever you think it sounds good. Now let's set up the clap. We'll be using the clap 707 sample. Put the claps on beats 2 and 4. This is our backbeat. Change fade out to 50 milliseconds and transpose to -1. We're going to enhance this backbeat element by adding a snare, the snare vinyl DLA 4 sample. We're going to put this in the exact same spot, beats 2 and 4. Set fade out to 80 milliseconds. Now we'll add a ghost note snare, a quieter snare. We'll use the snare clapper sample. I'm only going to use this once, on the very last 16th note of each bar. Reduce the volume to -15 decibels. Set the velocity sensitivity to 60%. Transpose up 3 semitones. Set fade out to 60 milliseconds. Set the filter mode to bandpass, 12 decibels per octave, and the frequency to 2 kilohertz. This is going to carve out a nice middle section of the frequencies. For the shaker, we're going to use the shaker short sample. We're going to use this in 3 different velocity layers. The highest velocity layer will be doubling the open hi-hat on the 8th note in between each quarter note, or kick. The second most intense velocity layer will be on the downbeats, right with the kicks. And the third and least intense velocity layer will be in between each of these, on the 16th notes. Set the velocity sensitivity to 60%. Fade in to 8 milliseconds and fade out to 30 milliseconds. Activate the filter and set the mode to bandpass, 12 decibels per octave. Frequency to 10,000 hertz. By using these different velocity layers, we kinda get the feel of a shaker. Throughout the arrangement, there's a crash symbol that punctuates the different sections. For this, we're going to use the crash mansion sample. Rhythmically, this is very simple. It's right on beat 1. Reduce the volume to -26 decibels. Transpose down 1 semitone. Fade in 30 milliseconds. And fade out 1.2 seconds. There's a snare fill that happens throughout the arrangement. For this, we're going to use the Snare Vinyl 07 sample. The main emphasis points of the fill are these 2 notes. We'll add to the rhythmic activity by adding a 16th note right before the first one and right after the second one. These will both be at slightly lower velocities. Lastly, we'll add 2 30-second notes at significantly lower velocities right before the second main accent point of the fill. Reduce the volume to -14 decibels, transpose down 1 semitone, fade in by 1 millisecond, fade out to 20 milliseconds, set filter mode to high pass, 24 decibels per octave, and set the frequency to 150 hertz. This shaves off some of the low end and makes it a little less heavy. Now let's check out the drum effects chain. Add glue compressor, reduce the threshold to -12 decibels, and increase the makeup gain by 6 decibels. This makes it a little punchier and louder. Now we'll add drum bus. Set the dry wet to 30%. Increase crunch to 20%. Increase damp to 20 kilohertz. Increase transients to 0.5. This really enhances the initial impact of each transient and also really brings up the reverb tail in the mix. This is a fun one. Add vocoder. Keep all the settings at their defaults, but decrease the dry wet all the way down to 25%. This is a great way to kind of bridge the gap between electric and acoustic drum sounds. Now add channel EQ. I've boosted the low end way up by 10 decibels. And I've increased the highs by 1 decibel. This just really makes the kick punch a lot harder. Lastly, add utility. Activate bass mono and set that frequency to 150 Hz. This just keeps the low end right in the center. Now for the sub bass. It's super simple. It just plays the roots of the chords. Each note lasts for one whole bar. E flat for 1 bar, D for a bar, G for a bar, back to D for a bar. There's really not much variation at all to this. To get this sound, we'll use Ableton's analog. In the global settings, change the voice amount to mono. This makes it so it can only produce one tone at a time and prevents any overlapping notes, which is the quickest way to get muddiness in your low end. Deactivate oscillator 2. Change oscillator 1's shape to square. Now head over to the amp 1 panel, set attack to 25 milliseconds. Set sustain to 1. Now head over to the filter panel. First, turn the ENV setting envelope to 0. Set the frequency to 250 Hz and the resonance to 25%. This cuts out almost all of those high-end harmonics of the square wave and leaves us just with that deep subtone. Now let's activate oscillator 2 and add a layer that will help the bass cut through the mix in the low mids. Increase the octave parameter by 1. Now we've got a little bit more information happening in the low mids. As far as an effects chain, all we need to add is a compressor to achieve that same side chain pumping effect that we achieved with the organ. Set this up exactly the same way as we did before. Here's a couple small adjustments specifically catered to the bass sound. Set threshold to -40 decibels, ratio to 4:1, attack to 2 milliseconds, and release to 10 milliseconds. You can dial this in however it sounds good to you, but I'm usually listening for a significant enough dip in volume to get that pumping effect without ruining the natural flow of the bass line. There's another bass type of sound. It's a bass riff that adds rhythmic punctuation while sitting above the sub-bass register. You can almost think of this as a tenor part, like a cello. This part is active in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th bars, and in each of those bars emphasizes notes from the chord that is sounding at that time. In bar 2, the bass riff plays the notes A and D, A being the 5th of D minor 7 and D being the root. D minor 7 is the chord that is playing during bar 2. Rhythmically, it is playing on the 3rd and 4th 16th notes of beat 2. In this style, and especially this tempo, when you see an element emphasizing these weak or less rhythmically stable parts of the bar, you can be sure that it's an element that's adding to the groove. This is a prime example of syncopation. In the 3rd bar, the bass riff continues to reiterate notes from the chords sounding at that time, which is G minor 11, no 9, aka G minor 7, add 4. Doesn't really matter what you call it, the important thing is that it's an extended G minor chord. It starts with G, right on the downbeat, not syncopated at all. Then it goes to D, which is the 5th of the chord, leaping up to F, the 7th, where it then falls down to C, the 11th or 4th, finally landing on G, the root. F, C, and G are all the same distance from one another, a perfect 4th. In contemporary electronic music, it's not at all uncommon to see stacks of perfect intervals like this, perfect 4ths or perfect 5ths. 4, we get another bass riff, and it's again taking notes from the chord at that time, which is D minor 7. We have 2 A notes that each leap up to a note in the chord, A being the 5th, C being the 7th, and D being the root. The top 2 notes are more emphasized because they're leapt up to, and these provide a little melodic resolution, the 7 to the root. Also, this is essentially the same rhythm as bar 3. A little bit of repetition there, strengthening the idea. All these analytical details are useful to gain an intellectual understanding of what's going on, but it's important to point out, I'm sure this bass riff was arrived upon without thinking about any of this stuff. It was probably just an instinctual, feel-driven, jam-based kind of thing that came into being, if I had to guess. Now let's take a look at how to make this sound using Ableton's wavetable synth. We'll set the wave position to 100%. Now let's dial in the amp envelope to get a much shorter sound. Decay to 135 milliseconds. Turn the sustain all the way down. Now we'll turn the frequency of filter 1 down to 200 Hz, and we'll increase the resonance to 25%. You may see a pattern here with our bass sounds and their filters. You can use more harmonically rich wave shapes like square waves and saw waves, but still get a deeper sub-bass kind of quality by using the filter to shave almost the entire frequency spectrum down to 200 Hz in this case, or even lower sometimes. Now activate the sub-oscillator. Turn the gain up to 0 decibels, and make sure the octave setting is at -1, which essentially turns this into a kind of octave pedal for your synth, duplicating all the notes 1 octave lower. Now go over to the MIDI tab. We're going to use the velocity column to make some parameters of the synth velocity sensitive. Set the velocity sensitivity of oscillator 1's pulse width to 20. This makes it so that the greater the velocity the note is played with, the more the pulse width will be modulated. You can do this to just about any parameter in Wavetable by first clicking the parameter you want to modulate, which will make it appear in this MIDI window or the modulation matrix. Then you can choose which modulation source you want to affect that parameter and dial in a positive or negative value. We're going to repeat this process for oscillator 1's sync and also filter 1's frequency. This is a great way to make synths come to life, is by adding lots of small little variations from a lot of different modulation sources. Now if we go back to our piano roll and look at our bass riff, you can see that we have 3 different velocity levels going on. 25, 60, and then all the way up at 127. The synth responds differently to each of these layers of velocity and makes the bass riff more dynamic and lifelike. This is also a great way to control which notes are going to actually pop out in the mix. Now let's take a look at the effects chain. I used EQ8 to roll off the lows at 150 Hz. Because remember, we still have a sub-bass. This sound needs to sit on top of that sub-bass. I then boosted the low mids at 250 Hz by 2 decibels. I then lowered the highs starting at 5 kHz by 6 decibels. Next, we'll use compressor to get that same sidechain pumping effect that we already have used with the sub-bass and the organ sound. This will be set up the same way with the kick as the input source with a few small adjustments. Set the threshold to -32 decibels. The ratio to 3:1. Attack to 5 milliseconds. And release to 20 milliseconds. Lastly, we'll use hybrid reverb to get these very short bass notes to ring out. Set the pre-delay to 5 milliseconds. Change the convolution reverb impulse response to Ableton Studio Mid to give it a room reverb effect. And change the algorithm to Chords to get that modulated reverb tail. Now change the dry wet to 40%. In order to prevent the bass of this sound, especially the sub bass, from overwhelming the reverb and creating a huge boomy muddy sound, let's use the reverb EQ to cut the lows all the way up to 600 Hertz with a slope of 24 decibels per octave. That's a bass riff. This song makes pretty extensive use of a white noise riser transition effect, or whatever you want to call it. There's two variations throughout the arrangement. One lasts for 1 bar and is pretty quick. The other builds up over the course of 4 bars. Here they are. We will make this sound using Ableton's Analog. Analog has a dedicated and pretty flexible noise generator, so we're going to use that. We don't even need the oscillators, so go ahead and deactivate oscillator 1 and 2 and activate the noise generator. The noise generator doesn't track the key, so you don't have to worry about which note you're punching in. Any note will trigger the same effect in the synth. Turn color, which is the noise generator's built-in filter, all the way up to 22 kilohertz. Now head over to Filter 1's panel and turn the ENV setting, which is the filter envelope, all the way down to 0. This will make it so that the filter envelope isn't affecting the sound. Change the filter type to high pass 12 decibels. This is going to shave off the low end, which we don't need for this transition effect. Set this to 1000 Hertz. Now we won't hear any of this swooshy white noise going on until 1000 Hertz, where it starts to be perceived as that kind of oceany, windy type of sound. Before we continue, let's make sure our signal path is all good to go. Let's turn off amp 1 and activate filter 2 and amp 2. Now the signal flow starts with the noise generator, goes through filter 1, then that signal goes through filter 2, and then gets outputted through amp 2. Now turn off filter 2's envelope by setting ENV to 0. Now we can create this transition effect by automating the cutoff frequency of filter 2 in coordination with our arrangement. For the short 1 bar transition effect, it'll start closed all the way down at 30 Hertz and then smoothly rise all the way up to 18,000 Hertz and then close back down quickly. For the longer 4 bar transition effect, it'll start in the same way, close down all the way to 30 Hertz, and then over the course of 3 bars, open up smoothly to 6 kilohertz, and then over the course of the 4th final bar, open up from 6 to 12 kilohertz. You could do this 1,000 different ways. These were the settings and the frequencies that I felt matched the tune. During the longer 4 bar transition, there is a chord swell effect. You could achieve this in a whole bunch of ways, but I thought the simplest, most elegant way for my purposes was to send the organ's audio to a separate track and then process it there. Create a new track, set the input to the organ track, and now set the monitor to in, which makes it so that we are always going to hear the organ signal on this track, a sort of live resampling. But we don't want to hear the organ for the whole song on this track. We only want to hear it during the transition. So I used auto filter and automated the frequency to open up during this 4 bar transition. It does a very similar thing as the white noise filter. It's starting completely closed and then opens up over the course of 3 bars up to 6 kilohertz, and then in the 4th bar opens from 6 to 12 kilohertz. Otherwise, the filter is closed and the track is effectively muted. But we're missing the key ingredient here. We don't want to just duplicate the organ sound. We want to change it so it's a swelling, long, non-percussive kind of sound. To do this, we'll use spectral time. And make sure you add spectral time before autofilter. Turn off the delay. Set the resolution to ultra to get the most detailed kind of effect here. Now switch to re-trigger mode. Set to onsets, which will freeze the audio of each incoming transient based on the sensitivity setting, which we'll set to 50%. And then we'll set the crossfade, which is the way that those different freezes will be crossfaded between each other, to somewhere in the middle. 1.3 seconds will work. And one more thing before we activate freeze. Right-click the context menu, which is where the title of the effect is on the top, and activate Avoid Freezing Onsets. This will make it so that the effect will try to avoid capturing and freezing the audio of the initial transient and instead grab the harmony or the melodic idea instead. A technical way to think of it is that it's adding a slope to the attack of the transients and creating a smoother sound. Now activate freeze. I then added reverb and sidechain compression to this sound to get it to sit and gel in the mix a little better. Now the percussive rhythms of the organ becomes more of a floaty pad texture as the white noise effect opens up. Lastly, there's a guitar part that's peppered in throughout the arrangement. The notes of the guitar part are mainly coming from the G minor pentatonic scale. It goes like this. I included this part in the project file that you can download on Patreon as MIDI as well. As for the guitar tone, I used channel EQ to pretty much remove the low end and boost the mids and highs. I then added sidechain compression and echo and reverb. The last thing I want to show you are two elements of the arrangement that kind of glue the song together or propel the momentum. The first is a bit of a fake out, where the section builds and then on the downbeat, beat 1, the drums and the bass drop out, leaving only the organ playing on beat 1, and then on beat 2 the groove starts right back up again. It's effective, kind of just stops the song in its track just to keep you on your toes. The second is during the build-up, bridge, or whatever you want to call it section, the chord progression lands on the one chord and stays there for a number of bars. During this section, the chord swell effect takes on a more primary role and builds up as that whole build-up is progressing, along with the kick doubling up and other elements like the white noise riser increasing in intensity. And there you have it. What a life indeed. If you'd like to download this project file, as well as all the other project files to the track remakes and tutorials you find on this channel, you can do so on my Patreon. Also, if you need a guide through these perilous musical waters, I offer lessons over Zoom. Email me at jaronlessons@gmail.com for info and scheduling. And as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.